May 10th, 1945. The outskirts of Tokyo, Japan. The sky arrives first a sound. A low rumble that builds from the horizon. Familiar and terrible, the mechanical thunder that has meant death for months. In the ruins of what was once a residential neighborhood in Koto Ward, 53-year-old Yamamoto Keiko crouches in the skeletal remains of a family's home, pulling her 2 grandchildren close. The walls are gone, burned away in the fire-bombing raids of March. Only the concrete foundation remains, and the twisted metal frame of what used to be the kitchen. She does not look up. There is no point. You cannot dodge what falls from American B-29s. You can only wait and hope that this one time, the bombs will fall somewhere else. The engine sound grows louder, multiple aircraft, flying lower than the high-altitude bomber formations that have turned Tokyo into a landscape of ash and rubble. Keiko presses her children's faces against her chest, as if a body could shield them from fire that falls from the sky like rain. She whispers a prayer to ancestors she is no longer certain are listening. The sound reaches a crescendo directly overhead. She closes her eyes, waits for the shriek of falling bombs, the flash, the obliteration. Instead, she hears impact. Not the concussive roar of explosives, but a softer sound, like heavy sacks hitting earth. Multiple impacts, scattered across the ruined neighborhood. Keiko opens her eyes. No flash, no fire. The aircraft engines are fading now, moving away to the south. Silence returns, broken only by the wind moving through the skeletal remains of burned buildings. Then she hears it. Voices. Neighbors emerging from hiding, calling to each other in tones of confusion rather than terror. She stands, slowly, bones aching from malnutrition and the constant crouch of fear, walks toward the street, toward where others are gathering around objects that have fallen from the sky. Not bombs, packages, large burlap sacks that are split open on impact, spilling their contents across the rubble-strewn ground. Rice, canned goods, powdered milk, chocolate bars in green wrappers, medical supplies in wooden crates stenciled with English words she cannot read. Food. The Americans have dropped food. Keiko falls to her knees in the ash and dust, staring at a split sack of rice as if it were a ghost. Around her, others are weeping, or laughing, or standing frozen in shock. An old man clutches a can of Spam to his chest like a sacred object. A young mother scoops powdered milk into her hands, unable to believe it is real. Children, too young to understand what they are seeing, pick up chocolate bars and stare at them with hollow, hungry eyes. For months, the imperial government has told them that Americans are demons, that surrender will mean torture and extermination, that death is preferable to the humiliation of defeat. For months, they have starved as a naval blockade has choked off food imports and American bombing has destroyed what little agriculture remains. For months, they have been taught that the enemy across the Pacific wants nothing but their annihilation. And now the sky, which has rained fire and death for so long, has rained food. To understand the shock that freezes Yamamoto Keiko and millions like her, we must first understand what Japanese civilians have been taught to expect from defeat, from Americans, from the end of this war that has consumed their world. From the moment Japan launched its empire-building campaigns in the 1930s, the ideology of the militarist state had prepared its population not for the possibility of defeat, but for the necessity of dying rather than accepting it. The concept of gyokusai, honorable death, death rather than surrender, permeated every layer of society. School children were drilled in the belief that Americans were Kichiku Beiai, Anglo-American devils and beasts, who would rape, torture, and murder civilians if Japan fell. This was not mere propaganda divorced from reality. Japanese civilians had witnessed their own military's brutality in China, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific territories. They understood what conquest looked like, what occupying armies did. The assumption, never questioned in public discourse, was that Americans would visit the same horrors upon Japan. The Imperial Military Command had reinforced this expectation as American forces drew closer to the home islands, distributing weapons to civilians, training women and children to fight with bamboo spears, preparing the population for a final apocalyptic battle in which every Japanese person will become a soldier and every death a sacrifice to the emperor. By the spring of 1945, this ideology confronted material reality that made its promises increasingly hollow. The naval blockade imposed by American submarines had reduced food imports to a trickle. The strategic bombing campaign had destroyed 64 major cities, killed hundreds of thousands, and left millions homeless. On March 9th to 10th, a single night of firebombing in Tokyo killed more people than the atomic bomb would later kill in Hiroshima. Estimates range from 80,000 to 100,000 dead in a single night, with 1 million left homeless. The survivors wandered through a landscape that resembled the end of the world. Entire districts reduced to ash, canals choked with bodies, the smell of burned flesh hanging in the air for days. Yet even in this nightmare, the ideology held. Surrender was unthinkable. The emperor's broadcast voice had never been heard by his subjects. He was too sacred to speak to them directly, and no one in authority suggested that defeat was imminent or surrender possible. Instead, the rhetoric intensified. The Americans were coming to destroy Japan utterly. Every citizen must prepare to die fighting. This was the only honorable path, the only way to preserve the kokutai, the national essence, the sacred polity centered on the emperor. Into this landscape of total war and apocalyptic ideology, American food drops arrived like messages from an alternate universe. The Japanese civilians expected annihilation. What they received, in those strange spring days of 1945, were the early seeds of an American strategy that would come to define the occupation, the use of abundance as a psychological weapon more powerful than bombs. This was not mercy, precisely, though mercy was part of it. It was not mere pragmatism, though pragmatism certainly played a role. It was something more complex, a calculated demonstration that America possessed resources so vast that it could afford to feed its enemies even while still fighting them, and that American power was rooted not in cruelty but in productive capacity that seemed to have no limit. The food drops that began in early May 1945 were not spontaneous acts of kindness. They were part of a broader psychological warfare campaign designed by the Office of War Information and the Army Air Forces to undermine Japanese civilian morale and demonstrate the futility of continued resistance. The logic was straightforward. If civilians could see with their own eyes that Americans had food to spare, that the blockade choking Japan could be lifted the moment surrender came, that cooperation with occupation forces would mean survival rather than death, then perhaps the fanatic resistance that American planners feared would never materialize. The operations began tentatively. On May 3, 1945, B-29 bombers from the 314th Bombardment Wing, operating from bases in the Mariana Islands, flew low-level missions over the ruins of Kawasaki and dropped leaflets explaining that food would follow as civilians moved away from military installations. The leaflets, written in Japanese by Nisei translators, were blunt. "Your military leaders have lied to you. We do not wish to harm civilians. We have food. We will share it if you help us end this war." Few believed the leaflets. They seemed like obvious trickery, a way to lure civilians into the open where they could be machine-gunned. But on May 7th, the first actual food drops occurred over a refugee camp outside Yokohama. 12 tons of supplies, rice, canned goods, powdered milk, and medical supplies, fell from modified bomb bays, parachutes blooming white against the gray sky. American pilots reported seeing crowds scatter in terror, then slowly, cautiously approach the fallen packages. Within an hour, every scrap had been collected. By mid-May, food drops were occurring almost daily over areas where civilian populations were concentrated and military presence minimal. The quantities were not large enough to feed everyone. The strategic bombing campaign continued simultaneously, and the blockade remained in force, but they were large enough to be visible, tangible, undeniable. The Americans could drop food. They chose to drop food. This simple fact could not be reconciled with months of propaganda insisting that Americans were demons bent on extermination. The documentary evidence of Japanese civilian reaction comes from diaries, letters, and post-war interviews. A school teacher named Tanaka Hiroshi, living in the ruins of Osaka, wrote in his diary on May 14, 1945, "Today American planes dropped packages instead of bombs. We watched from our shelter, certain it was a trick that the packages would explode when touched. But the Watanabe family, desperate with hunger, went to investigate. They returned with rice. Real rice. Their daughter was crying, holding a chocolate bar. Mrs. Watanabe kept saying, 'Why? Why would they do this?' No one had an answer. We have been told for years that Americans hate us, want to destroy us. Yet they drop food. It makes no sense. Nothing makes sense in them all." This cognitive dissonance was the weapon. More powerful than the bombs, more psychologically destabilizing than the leaflets, the food drops forced Japanese civilians to confront the possibility that everything they had been told about the enemy was false. If Americans were not demons, if they possessed compassion or at least pragmatic generosity, then perhaps surrender would not mean annihilation. Perhaps the military leaders who demanded Gyokusai were not protecting Japan but prolonging its agony. The symbolic power of food in this context cannot be overstated. Rice, the staple of Japanese diet, had become almost mythically scarce by 1945. Official rations had dropped to 1,575 calories per day in urban areas, barely enough to sustain life, and actual distributions were often far less as the distribution system collapsed under bombing and blockade. People ate sawdust mixed with what little rice could be obtained. They boiled grass and tree bark. They trapped rats and sparrows. In the countryside, farmers ate grain from government requisitions, knowing that cities were starving but unwilling to part with food their own families needed. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making even minor illnesses lethal. Children stopped growing. The elderly died quietly in unheated homes. In this landscape of hunger, rice became more than food. It became survival itself, the difference between life and death, hope and despair. The imperial government's inability to feed its population was the regime's most visceral failure, evident in every hollow face and distended belly. Yet the ideology demanded that civilians accept this suffering as proof of their devotion to the emperor, their willingness to sacrifice everything for the national essence. When American planes dropped rice, white rice, not the mixed grains and fillers that Japanese rations had become, they dropped evidence of a different kind of power. This was not the power to destroy, which everyone already knew America possessed. This was the power to produce, to have so much food that it could be given to enemies. For a population that had endured years of luxury as the enemy campaigns, that had been taught to make do with less and less until there was almost nothing left, the sight of Americans casually dropping food from the sky was cognitively overwhelming. The canned goods that accompanied the rice drops carried their own message. Spam, that much-mocked meat that American soldiers complained about, was protein, actual meat, in portions that seemed absurdly large to civilians who had not tasted meat in months. Powdered milk, which could be reconstituted to feed children, was a technology that Japanese civilians barely knew existed. Chocolate, included in the drops not as staple nutrition but as morale boost, as something sweet in a world that had forgotten sweetness, was almost incomprehensible luxury. American pilots reported that chocolate bars were often the last items taken from drop sites, as the civilians could not quite believe they were real or edible. Post-war interviews revealed that many families saved the chocolate, unable to eat it themselves, giving it to children who had never tasted anything so sweet. The chocolate became a symbol of American excess, of a nation so wealthy it could afford to give luxuries to its enemies. One woman, interviewed by occupation authorities in September 1945, described finding a chocolate bar in a food drop. "I thought it was a weapon at first, some kind of explosive disguised as food. I was afraid to touch it. My daughter, she was 8 years old, she picked it up and smelled it. She said it smelled like the candy her grandmother used to make before the war. We broke a tiny piece off and tasted it. It was real, sweet, rich, too rich. I felt sick after eating it because we had eaten nothing but watery rice for so long. But it was real. The Americans had so much food they could put candy in packages dropped from planes. I realized then that we could not win. You cannot defeat people who have so much that they give away candy." The transformation of perception among Japanese civilians was neither immediate nor universal. Many remained convinced that the food drops were poisoned or booby-trapped. Others believed they were a temporary trick, that once Japan surrendered, the Americans would show their true demonic nature. The most fervent believers in the imperial ideology saw the food drops as a test of loyalty. To accept food from the enemy was to betray the emperor and the millions who had already died for Japan. But hunger is a powerful solvent of ideology. As the food drops continued through May and into June, as more and more families faced the choice between starvation and accepting American food, the calculus shifted. Practical survival began to override ideological purity. Women, responsible for feeding their families, were often the first to rationalize accepting the drops. The military had failed to protect them. The government could not feed them. The Americans, for reasons that remained unclear, were offering food. Pride could not fill empty stomachs. Ideology could not keep children alive. The statistics, compiled by occupation authorities in the months after surrender, tell part of the story. Between May 7th and August 15th, 1945, American forces dropped approximately 4,500 tons of food and medical supplies over Japanese civilian areas. This was a tiny fraction of the tonnage of bombs dropped over the same period. The strategic bombing campaign continued unabated, but it was enough to feed roughly 500,000 people for a week and enough to be seen by millions more. Post-war surveys of Japanese civilians in the former combat zones found that 67% reported either witnessing a food drop or knowing someone who had. Of those who directly received food from the drops, 78% reported that it changed their perception of Americans as purely destructive enemies. These numbers are important because they quantify something difficult to measure: the psychological impact of generosity in the midst of war. The food drops did not stop the fighting. They did not prevent the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed over 200,000 people in early August. They did not spare Japan the horrors of Soviet invasion of Manchuria or the Emperor's surrender broadcast on August 15th. But they created a cognitive opening, a space of doubt about the totalizing narrative of American evil that the militarist government had constructed. When surrender finally came, when the Emperor's voice, never before heard by his subjects, crackled over radios across Japan announcing the endurance of the unendurable and the acceptance of Allied terms, many civilians were prepared to accept occupation partly because they had seen evidence that Americans might not be the demons they had been told to fear. The food drops had not created affection or trust, but they had created uncertainty about the narrative of inevitable annihilation. And in that uncertainty, there was room for survival. The evidence of how these perceptions shaped the early occupation is substantial. When American forces began landing in Japan on August 28, 1945, there was widespread fear among Japanese civilians that mass rape, looting, and murder would begin immediately. Women cut their hair short and dressed in men's clothing to avoid sexual assault. Families hid valuables and sometimes hid themselves, barricading doors and refusing to emerge. In some rural areas, entire villages evacuated into the mountains, preferring to starve in hiding rather than face what they assumed would be American savagery. Yet the violence did not come. Instead came more food. General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, made feeding the Japanese population one of his first priorities. Within weeks of landing, American forces were distributing food on a massive scale, not just to occupation personnel, but to Japanese civilians. Soup kitchens were established in Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, and other major cities. American soldiers handed out rations to children. Military supply chains that had been organized to support combat operations were redirected to prevent starvation among the defeated population. This was not pure altruism. American planners understood that starving populations become revolutionary populations, and that a stable occupation required keeping people fed. There were also genuine humanitarian concerns. Photographs of skeletal Japanese children provoked sympathy even among Americans who had lost family members to Japanese aggression. But regardless of motive, the result was clear. Americans arrived not as conquerors who took food, but as occupiers who brought it. Yamamoto Keiko, the grandmother who had crouched in ruins waiting for bombs and found food instead, kept a diary through the occupation years. In an entry from September 15, 1945, she wrote, "Today an American soldier gave my grandson a candy bar. The boy was playing in the street, and the soldier knelt down, smiled, and offered the candy. My grandson was afraid, but I nodded to him, and he took it. The soldier ruffled his hair and walked away. This is the enemy we were told would torture us to death. I do not understand. My son died fighting Americans in the Philippines. My daughter-in-law was killed in the firebombing. My home is ash. My city is ruins. Yet this American soldier gave candy to my grandson. What are we supposed to feel? How are we supposed to make sense of any of this?" This confusion, this inability to reconcile propaganda with experience, was the psychological foundation upon which the occupation was built. It did not erase anger or grief. Japanese civilians did not forget their dead or forgive the firebombings. But it created cognitive space for accepting occupation authority without the apocalyptic resistance that both sides had expected. The food drops of May and June had planted the seeds of this acceptance. The continued provisioning of food through the early occupation months allowed those seeds to grow. The recurring symbol in this transformation was rice. Not the abstract concept of rice, but actual white rice, distributed in American burlap sack stencil with English words that Japanese civilians learned to recognize, USANYN not for sale. In the first year of occupation, the United States shipped over 800,000 tons of food to Japan, much of it rice purchased from California and Arkansas and transported across the Pacific at enormous expense. This rice appeared in distribution centers, in school lunch programs, in relief stations for displaced persons. It was omnipresent, unavoidable, a daily reminder that American power was rooted in productive capacity that seemed infinite. The rice sacks themselves became a symbol within a symbol. They were repurposed by resourceful Japanese civilians into clothing, bags, even improvised shelter materials. 4 years after the war, you could see children wearing shirts made from rice sacks, the faded stencil still visible. USNY across a small back, rice, product of USA on a makeshift book bag. These repurposed sacks were markers of poverty and defeat, yes, but also of survival, of a strange new relationship between conqueror and conquered that did not follow the expected script. In traditional Japanese culture, rice carried profound symbolic weight. It was sacred, connected to Shinto deities and imperial legitimacy. The emperor himself performed ceremonial rice planting. To receive rice from Americans was to receive not just calories, but a kind of symbolic submission, the acknowledgement that Japan could not feed itself, that American abundance had replaced Japanese self-sufficiency, that the old order had collapsed and a new one, structured around American power and generosity, had taken its place. Some Japanese intellectuals, struggling to make sense of defeat and occupation, wrote about rice as a physical embodiment of America's victory. The writer Dazai Osamu, in his 1947 novel The Setting Sun, included a scene where a character reflects on eating American rice. It tasted different from Japanese rice. Fuller, somehow, as if each grain contained more substance. Or perhaps it only tasted different because it came from the hands of those who defeated us. We ate our defeat, grain by grain, and it kept us alive. This was the paradox at the heart of the occupation experience. The same nation that had firebombed Japanese cities and dropped atomic bombs was now feeding the survivors. The cognitive dissonance was immense, and different people resolved it in different ways. Some felt gratitude. Some felt humiliation. Some felt both simultaneously, a tangled knot of emotions that could not be easily separated. But almost everyone felt surprise. The demons they had been taught to fear had arrived with rice sacks and chocolate bars, and this simple fact rewrote their understanding of who Americans were and what defeat might mean. The transformation extended beyond material provision to something more subtle and perhaps more powerful, the demonstration of democratic values through the behavior of ordinary American soldiers. The Japanese public had been prepared for American troops to behave as Japanese troops had behaved in occupied territories, with brutality, entitlement, contempt for the conquered. Instead, they encountered young men from Iowa and Texas and New York who bought goods from Japanese merchants at fair prices, who returned lost items they found in the street, who showed awkward respect when entering shrines and temples. There were certainly crimes. American soldiers raped Japanese women, got drunk and brawled, occasionally behaved with the arrogance of conquerors. The occupation was not a utopia, and MacArthur's administration took pains to suppress negative reporting. But the scale of abuse was far less than Japanese civilians had been conditioned to expect, and the contrast between expectation and reality was stark enough to register. A police report from Yokohama, dated October 1945, noted, "Incidents of assault and theft by occupation personnel remain substantially lower than predicted." Several cases of American soldiers returning wallets and valuables to Japanese owners have been recorded. This behavior is inconsistent with propaganda descriptions of American character and has caused confusion among the civilian population. This dry, bureaucratic language captures something profound, the bewilderment of a population prepared for annihilation but experiencing something closer to normal military occupation, with all its indignities but without the systematic atrocity they had expected. The food drops had prepared the psychological ground for this reassessment. By August 1945, enough civilians had direct experience of American generosity, even if grudging or strategic generosity, that the image of Americans as pure demons had cracked. When occupation forces arrived and continued distributing food, when soldiers shared rations with hungry children, When violence occurred but was punished rather than encouraged by command, the crack widened into a fundamental shift in perception. This shift was essential to the success of the occupation. Unlike in Germany, where occupation authorities faced a population that had to be denazified through force and re-education, in Japan the psychological transformation began before the first occupation soldier landed. The food drops, combined with the Emperor's surrender broadcast that released subjects from their obligation to die fighting, created a population that was receptive to American authority not out of love or even acceptance, but out of exhausted recognition that survival required cooperation, and that cooperation might not be the apocalyptic betrayal they had been taught it would be. The long-term consequences of this transformation shaped modern Japan in ways that are still visible decades later. The generation that experienced the food drops and early occupation became the architects of post-war Japanese democracy and economic miracle. They had learned, viscerally and undeniably, that American-style abundance was real, that democracy and prosperity were not mutually exclusive, that Japan's militarist path had led to catastrophic defeat while America's democratic system had produced not just military victory but the surplus capacity to feed its defeated enemies. This lesson was taught not through lectures or re-education programs, though those came later, but through the physical experience of hunger met by American food, of fear met by relative restraint, of ideological certainty shattered by material reality. When post-war Japanese leaders built their new democratic institutions, when they allied Japan with American interests during the Cold War, when they adopted economic policies modeled on American capitalism, they did so in part because they had seen American power manifest not just in bombs but in bushels of rice. Yamamoto Keiko, the grandmother whose story opened this narrative, lived until 1973. In an oral history recorded 2 years before her death, she reflected on May 10, 1945, the day she first saw food fall from American planes. "I understood nothing that day. I could not make sense of it. Why would they feed us? We were the enemy. We had fought them across the Pacific. Our leaders told us Americans wanted to exterminate us. Yet they dropped food. For years afterward, I tried to understand. Eventually, I realized that perhaps understanding was not the point. The point was that they did it. They had the power to destroy us utterly, and they chose also to have the power to feed us. That choice, that they had both powers and used both, that is what America meant to us. Not goodness, exactly. Not evil, certainly. But power so vast they could afford to be generous even to enemies. We could not compete with that. We had to learn to live with it instead. And learning to live with it, we became something different than we had been. We became what we are now. What Japan became was the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s, a stable democracy, America's key Asian ally. The food drops of 1945 did not cause this transformation alone. The occupation policies, the Cold War context, Japanese agency, and adaptation all played crucial roles. But those drops planted something. The visceral knowledge that American power was rooted in abundance, that cooperation with that power might mean survival and even prosperity, that the ideology of Gyokusai and eternal war had led only to ash and starvation while the American model, for all its flaws and hypocrisies, had produced surplus enough to feed the world. The evidence of how deeply this lesson penetrated Japanese consciousness can be found in the most unexpected places. In the 1950s, Japanese farmers began adopting American agricultural techniques and equipment. By the 1960s, Japan was importing American wheat and corn in massive quantities, building food processing industries modeled on American examples. The rice that had symbolized American abundance during the occupation became, by the 1970s, a protected commodity in Japan. Domestically grown rice was sacred, but the agricultural system that produced it had been modernized using American methods and technology. The psychological transformation was even more striking in education. Japanese schools, reformed under occupation guidance, began teaching a version of history that acknowledged Japanese aggression and American magnanimity. Students learned about the food drops as part of a narrative in which American power, though destructive in war, had proven beneficial in peace. This was self-serving American propaganda, certainly, but it resonated because it corresponded to lived experience. The generation that had received American food told their children and grandchildren about it, and these family memories reinforced the official narrative in ways that pure propaganda could never achieve. By the 1980s, When Japan's economic success made it seem poised to overtake the United States, some Japanese intellectuals began to critique the subordinate partnership that the occupation had established. They argued that the food drops and early occupation generosity had created a psychological dependency, a sense that Japan owed America for its survival and prosperity. There was truth in this critique. But even the critics acknowledged that the alternative, the apocalyptic final battle that Japanese militarists had planned, the invasion and starvation that would have resulted, would have been immeasurably worse. The food drops had offered a third path between annihilation and unconditional surrender, survival through cooperation with a power that, however self-interested its motives, had the capacity and will to sustain life rather than just destroy it. That this path had been taken, that millions of Japanese civilians had chosen survival over ideological purity when the choice was offered in the form of rice falling from the sky, was the foundation of everything that followed. August 14, 1945. The same ruins in Koto Ward, Tokyo. Yamamoto Keiko stands in the space that used to be her home, listening to a radio that a neighbor has brought out into the street. The entire neighborhood has gathered, dozens of families who have survived the firebombing, the starvation, the slow collapse of everything they knew. The radio crackles with static, then resolves into a voice that no one has ever heard before but everyone recognizes. The Emperor. His voice is thin, formal, using court Japanese that ordinary people barely understand. But the meaning comes through. Japan has surrendered. The war is over. The unendurable must be endured. Around Keiko, people weep. Some from relief, some from shame, some from emotions too complex to name. Her grandson, the one she shielded from what she thought would be bombs, tugs at her sleeve. Grandmother, he asks, will the Americans still drop food? She does not know how to answer. She does not know if the food drops were a temporary tactic of war or a genuine preview of occupation policy. She does not know if Americans will be generous in victory or vengeful. She knows nothing, really, except that her grandson is hungry and that 3 months ago, Americans dropped rice instead of bombs. I think so, she tells him, though she has no basis for this hope except the memory of May 10th, of burlap sacks splitting open in the ruins, of rice spilling across ash and rubble like a promise. I think they will. She is right. Within 2 weeks, American food distribution will begin in earnest. Her grandson will eat rice from American sacks, will taste chocolate and can milk, will grow up in an occupied nation that becomes an ally, that transforms from militarist empire to democratic power. He will live to see Japan rebuild, to see Tokyo rise from ash into one of the world's great cities, to see his own grandchildren grow up in prosperity that would have seemed like fantasy in August 1945. But he will remember, because his grandmother will tell him the story again and again, the day the sky rained food instead of fire. He will remember that America's power was demonstrated not just in its capacity to destroy. Everyone knew that by August 1945, but in its capacity to create, to have so much that it could give to enemies, to offer survival alongside defeat. This is not a simple story of American benevolence. The food drops were tactics in a strategic campaign. The occupation that followed served American interests. The democratic institutions established in Japan were designed to create a stable ally in a Cold War that was already beginning. There is no moral purity here, no simple narrative of good triumphing over evil. But there is this. In the space between total war and uncertain peace, some people chose to drop food instead of only bombs. They made this choice for complicated reasons, strategic, humanitarian, pragmatic, but they made it, and millions of people who expected annihilation received rice instead. They received it from the hands of enemies, and it kept them alive, and in staying alive they were able to become something other than what their militarist leaders had told them they must be. The rice sacks with their English stencils, the chocolate bars that seemed like impossible luxuries, the powdered milk that fed starving children. These were the instrument of a power that Japan could not match and eventually chose not to fight. They were symbols of abundance so vast that it could afford generosity even in the midst of war, of a democratic system that, for all its flaws, had produced surplus while authoritarianism had produced only scarcity. Japanese civilians were stunned when American pilots dropped food instead of bombs because the gesture made no sense within the ideological framework they had been given. Enemies do not feed each other. Victors do not sustain the defeated. Demons do not show mercy. Yet the food fell anyway, and in falling, it shattered the certainty that had made apocalyptic sacrifice seem like the only honorable path. What grew from that shattered certainty was not perfect. The occupation had its cruelties. The post-war order had its injustices. The prosperity that eventually came to Japan was built on American Cold War strategy as much as Japanese hard work. But it was life, and life contained possibilities that Gyokusai did not. It contained the possibility that former enemies might become allies, that defeated nations might be rebuilt rather than destroyed, that power could manifest not just in the capacity to annihilate but in the choice to sustain. The sky that had brought fire also brought food. This simple, impossible fact became the foundation of a different world. Not a perfect world, but one in which Yamamoto Keiko's grandson could grow up, in which her great-grandchildren could live in peace and prosperity, in which the choice to survive rather than die could be honored rather than condemned as betrayal. The rice that fell from American plains in May 1945 sustained bodies, but it also planted an idea that abundance was possible, that cooperation might lead to prosperity rather than humiliation, that the future did not have to be apocalypse. This idea, nourished by American policy and Japanese adaptation, grew into the modern partnership between former enemies. The transformation was never simple or complete, but it began in the ruins of Tokyo, in the space between the last bombs and the first occupation soldiers, when the sky opened and instead of fire, food rained down on a starving city. And a grandmother, expecting death, found rice instead, and lived, and remembered, and taught her grandchildren that the world was stranger and more full of possibilities than ideology allows, that enemies can become allies, that power need not always destroy. This is a truth that the food drops taught, that abundance shared is more powerful than scarcity enforced, that generosity, even strategic generosity, can reshape nations in ways that conquest alone cannot, that the choice to sustain life is itself a kind of victory. Not a victory of good over evil, but a victory of life over death, of possibility over apocalypse, of a future that could be lived rather than a past that could only be mourned. The rice fell, the people lived, and in living, they became something new,